Hello, I'm Robert, fact check, quality fact check, and helping if you're scared of many things. And this is people are scared because the news make a big story about Russia's won Avdiivka, which is it's just a tiny city like Bognor Regis or Palm Springs. And imagine that the news said that after 4 months of fighting, Russia has taken Bognor Regis. It's a tiny city, a resort city in or town or city in England. This is it, and then this is Avdiivka, which is about the same size as that place, and it's got an industrial area. It's got a quarry, a pull from a quarry, and it's got a railway line that goes through it. It used to be the railway line goes from Russian to Ukraine territory, so it's not much use for Ukraine. And then it used to have this coking coal factory, which is now, as you can see, is completely ruined, which supplied the coal to Mariupol. So Russia has taken this small place, and in the process it's completely ruined it. So it's just piles of rubble everywhere. Now, most of the houses are just completely destroyed. This is a typical house now in Avdiivka. I've got a picture down here, like that. So the houses would all have to be rebuilt, and essentially it's a king of a castle of a pile of rubble, and this is the result of Russia's war. And it would essentially, if Russia used all of its vast foreign reserves, that would not be enough to pay for the reconstruction of what it's destroyed in Ukraine. So this makes absolutely no economic sense for Russia to take Ukraine, to fight this war. And they have not achieved anything sensible. What they've done is they've lost various figures. It could be 16,000, it could be 47,000, but they've lost thousands of soldiers and 364 tanks, or certainly more than 300, and that figure is quite believable. And they could have kept them to help defend against. This is where Ukraine is likely to go through in a counter-offensive. It's already through the minefields, and it's all poised for a counter-offensive, which it took all summer to go through because the minefield was so wide and so well constructed, and the NATO equipment wasn't good enough to go through, so they had to use a different method, which took them all summer. And they're all poised for a counter-offensive, but it never happened. And this is the most difficult thing, and this is not giving away any secrets, because that is very obviously what they were aiming for. There's only reason why an army would do that, to go through a front line like that, is because they plan a counter-offensive through there. And so they clearly at some point plan to widen that breach, and they want to threaten liberate the Azov Sea. And so it's just plain as the nose in your face that is what Ukraine is doing. So if Russia had any sense at all, they would be building barriers around there and preparing for this counter-offensive. Instead, they are losing a small army in Avdiivka, instead of doing the sensible thing of preparing for the counter-offensive, which is very obviously going to happen. And then there's also clearly preparing for something else across the Dnipro River. So at some point, and probably this summer, then probably the Ukraine is in a far better position than it was last year, because it's now through the front line. Russia has not repaired it, as far as we can tell. Ukrainian intelligence will know better. Ukraine has had the modern tanks now for getting on for a year. So they have plenty of time to train. They've actually used them in combat. They haven't used very many of them. They've got vast numbers of spare Western tanks ready to put into battle. they've got the infantry fighting vehicles, they've got an extra Patriot system which gives them more protection along the front line, and then they'll have the F-16 fighter jets, and then if the US bill goes through, they will have the ATACMS, which will have the longer range ones of 300 kilometers. And so Ukraine is in a much stronger position now than it was this time last year. Although this time last year they didn't realise how difficult the minefields were to go through. So they thought they were in a strong position this time last year, but they are in a much stronger position now than they were back then. And Ukraine is not going to do counteroffensives in winter. It's not going to do any of this until April or May, because this is a very stupid time of year to do a counteroffensive or an offensive, and that is why, and Russia was very dim for Russia to make this a winter objective. So this, we don't know what's going to happen, but it might be major counteroffensives in spring to summer this year, and if not, then they would be certainly making sure that weakening Russia as much as they could in ready for a counteroffensive in 2025. And the main people are trying to persuade the US Congress to pass this bill on the basis of saying, if you don't, then Russia is going to take over Ukraine. That makes no sense. Nobody has put forward any credible future where Russia would retake Kherson City or Kharkiv City. So it makes absolutely no sense. They're going to go rampaging across Ukraine and take Kiev. And Ukraine is low on artillery. It isn't without artillery. It has a constant supply of artillery from Europe. It's not like it's got fixed stocks. It's got supply from Europe. It's making some shells itself. It's got it's put factories in place, actually building NATO shells in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, and NATO equipment and repairing their tanks. So they are not defenseless, and Europe has stepped up, and all of Europe, just about every European country, even Iceland, which doesn't even have an army, it's contributed a field hospital to Ukraine. So it's being a real unifying of Europe, that just about all countries in Western Europe are involved in one way or another. They are actively involved in assisting Ukraine by sending them equipment in one way or another, or helping them, or doing making things in their factories, or helping Ukraine to set up a factory in Ukraine. So it's a big effort by the whole of Europe to help Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. But they hold back some of their best weapons because they're afraid of escalation. So they don't give Ukraine certain things that would make things far easier for them. And that has been quite a strange thing all through this war, because generally the invader of a country doesn't get to dictate to the country it invades what its allies are permitted to send to it. But they are just Putin's bluffs. It's basically his nuclear bluffs he uses over and over again, which he uses to persuade NATO countries to not give Ukraine some of their best equipment, and to persuade them to tell Ukraine that it can only use their equipment they do supply against targets in occupied Ukraine. So, but Ukraine has its own equipment that it uses deep within Russia, and attacks deep within Russia, which are legitimate defensive targets, such as factories that Russia is using to make tanks and missiles and things to fight in Ukraine, and that is a legitimate defensive target. And but NATO countries just won't permit Russia to use their cruise missiles and things to attack the Russian factories that are making the weapons that are being used to attack them in Ukraine. But Ukraine is using its not so powerful drones and sabotage and various methods to attack those factories as well. So that's the situation where Ukraine is very, Russia is really on its back foot and winning. It seems to have won in Avdiivka, but it's won by losing. It's won by losing so many tanks, so many soldiers, and Ukraine comes into 2024 with in a far stronger position than it was in at the start of 2023. And so that's the main, and even without the US aid, then it's in a far stronger position than at the start of 2023. And if the US aid comes through, then that will be a big boost. And that really is how, if they were presenting it honestly, then that is what the US bill is about. It's about whether Ukraine can do a big counteroffensive now, or maybe a smaller counteroffensive now, and the main counteroffensive in 2025. And that basically is what the US bill is about. And it's the Senate sent a very strong signal with their 70 votes to tell the House of Representatives to vote for this bill. The House of Representatives, of course, went on recess, which I think is a delaying action because I think they know what they're going to. If they were very sure they were going to reject it, they wouldn't need to do that. So I think they're deliberating and they know they're going to have to approve it. They're just having to delay it. So I think there's a good chance that the House of Representatives is going to pass this bill. But you shouldn't rely on that and say that they definitely will, and Ukraine will be fine. And you will see, if the US don't pass this bill, you will see that Russia does not start rampaging across Ukraine. It doesn't take Kherson City. It doesn't take Kharkiv. It doesn't. You will see that Ukraine will be doing small counteroffensives and possibly large counteroffensives anyway, even without this bill. That is pretty obvious. So anyway, that's the main point that people are scared of. And then the other final thing I say in my longer video is that if at the end of the war, when Russia loses, which seems pretty certain is going to happen from my perspective, based on the sources I use, and if I'm understanding them correctly, then once Russia has lost the war, then people say, but then once Putin's lost the war, he's going to attack NATO. Now, this is like saying, after a fight with an armadillo and you lose against an armadillo, then you're going to say, okay, I lost against an armadillo, this means I am able to attack a lion. It doesn't make sense. It's absolutely obvious that NATO is far, far stronger than Ukraine. It makes no sense that that Russia, after losing a battle with Ukraine, would decide that it should attack NATO. That makes absolutely no sense. So when the Russian generals start talking about that, I think it's just in a fantasy kind of, it's making up a scenario for a military exercise. It doesn't make sense in reality that after losing the war in Ukraine, that Russia would then decide that it needs to rebuild, and what it really must do is to attack NATO. That makes no sense. Indeed, I think that Ukrainian people would be very much like when the Soviet Union lost the war in Afghanistan, and many people think that is the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Then this would probably be either lead to break up of the Russian Federation, or maybe a shift towards the more democratic, more peaceful Russia that quite a lot of Russians want, and law-abiding Russia, and some movement in that direction. It wouldn't happen all at once. It didn't happen instantly after the Afghanistan war, but over a period of time, after the end of the Ukrainian invasion and after losing, then Putin, might well stay in power, but he'd be much weaker. and and then gradually it would shift to something else, and it might lead to breakup of the Federation, it might lead to a change of the Russian Federation. So people talk about various possibilities at the end of what happens at the end of the war. It is highly unlikely that Russia decides, having lost this war, that what they need to do is to fight another war like this. I don't see it, and nobody has really spelt it out in a way that makes sense. So, and certainly they're not going to want to attack NATO after having lost against Ukraine. So anyway, hopefully that helps you and helps you put it in a different perspective. And I'm not sugarcoating this, I'm not trying to make things look positive, I'm just presenting things exactly as I personally see it at the moment, based on the best sources I can find. And that's all I'm doing here. And I hope this helps you, and hopefully helps you to be a bit less scared.